The phone call to Oaks Ridge Country Club lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and by the end of it, Cameron Ashford understood that the conversation was not going the way he had expected. He was sitting in his apartment in Brookhaven, Georgia, a suburb northeast of Atlanta, on a Tuesday morning in late September 2025, with his laptop open to a spreadsheet tracking RSVPs for his father's 70th birthday celebration. The event was still 2 months away, scheduled for the Saturday after Thanksgiving, and Cameron had been working on the logistics for weeks: guest list, catering options, entertainment, photography, and most importantly, the venue. His father, David Ashford, had been a member of Oaks Ridge Country Club for 18 years, had played golf there every Saturday morning, weather permitting, had hosted business dinners in the private dining rooms, had celebrated Cameron's college graduation there with a party that his mother had planned down to the last napkin fold. The club was, in many ways, a second home to David, and when Cameron had asked him where he wanted to hold his birthday celebration, David had said without hesitation, "Oaks Ridge. Where else?" So Cameron had called the club's events coordinator, a woman named Patricia Henley, whose voice on the phone was smooth and professional, the kind of voice that had been trained to sound welcoming without ever being warm. He had explained what he needed: the large ballroom for approximately 150 guests, a seated dinner, open bar, the works. Patricia had asked for the date, and Cameron had given it, and she had confirmed that the ballroom was available. Then she had asked for his name. "Cameron Ashford," he had said, spelling it out carefully because he had learned over the years that people often assumed his name was spelled differently, that they expected something more conventional or less formal. There was a pause on the line, the sound of typing, and then Patricia had said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford, but I'm not seeing you in our membership directory. Are you a member of Oaks Ridge?" Cameron had felt the first flicker of unease, a tightening in his chest that he tried to ignore. "No, I'm not a member, but my father is. David Ashford. I'm booking the event on his behalf." Another pause. Longer this time. More typing. Then Patricia's voice, slightly cooler now, slightly more distant. "I see. Well, Mr. Ashford, our event spaces are reserved for members and their immediate families. If your father would like to book the space, he'll need to call directly or submit a request through the member portal." Cameron had frowned, confused. "I am immediate family. I'm his son, and I'm calling because he asked me to handle the logistics. Is there a problem?" "No problem," Patricia had said, in a tone that suggested there was very much a problem. "It's just club policy. Events must be booked by the member themselves, or by someone listed as an authorized user on the membership account. If you're not listed, then I'm afraid I can't proceed with the booking." It was the phrasing that caught Cameron's attention, the careful, legalistic language that felt less like policy and more like pretext. He had helped his father book events at Oaks Ridge before, years ago when he was in college, and his mother was planning a surprise anniversary party. No one had asked him then whether he was an authorized user. No one had questioned his right to make arrangements on his father's behalf. But that had been over the phone, and he had not given his first name, had simply said he was calling for David Ashford, and perhaps that had been enough. Now, though, something was different. Cameron could hear it in Patricia's voice, in the way she had shifted from friendly efficiency to bureaucratic gatekeeping in the span of a single question. He took a breath, kept his voice level, and said, "I understand. Let me call my father and have him reach out directly. But just so I'm clear, if he calls and asks you to work with me on the details, that would be acceptable, correct?" "Yes," Patricia had said, though she did not sound entirely certain. "As long as the member authorizes it, we can work with a family member on event planning." "Great," Cameron had said, and ended the call. He sat at his desk for a moment, staring at the phone, feeling the familiar weight of understanding settle over him. He was 32 years old, a software engineer at a fintech startup that had just closed a Series C funding round, and he had spent his entire life learning to read the subtext of conversations like the one he had just had. The hesitation, The policy invoked suddenly and conveniently, the shift in tone when his name was spoken aloud. He knew what it meant, even if he could not prove it, even if the person on the other end of the line would deny it if asked directly. If you are reading this and thinking about the small ways that access is granted or denied based on assumptions about who you are, about the invisible barriers that appear when your name or your voice or your appearance does not match expectations, then you understand why Cameron Ashford sat in his apartment that Tuesday morning, feeling a rising anger that had nothing to do with the inconvenience of having to make a second phone call, and everything to do with the knowledge that once again he was being told he did not belong. He called his father. David Ashford answered on the third ring, his voice distracted, the sound of a keyboard clicking in the background. "Hey, Cam, what's up?" "Dad, I just called Oaksridge to book the ballroom for your birthday, and they said I can't make the reservation because I'm not a member and I'm not listed as an authorized user on your account. Can you call them and authorize me to work with their events coordinator?" There was a pause, and the keyboard clicking stopped. "They said that?" "Yeah. The woman I spoke to, Patricia Henley, said it's club policy that events have to be booked by the member directly or by an authorized user." David made a sound of frustration. "That's ridiculous. I've never heard of that policy. Let me call them right now and sort this out." "Thanks, Dad." They hung up, and Cameron returned to his spreadsheet. Though his focus was gone, his attention pulled back to the phone call, to the way Patricia's voice had changed, to the assumptions he suspected but could not prove. He had been navigating these assumptions his entire life, the son of a black billionaire in a world that still expected wealth and power to look a certain way. His father had built Ashford Capital from nothing, starting as a financial analyst in the 1980s and eventually founding a private equity firm that managed over $12 billion in assets. David was respected, feared in some circles, courted by politicians and philanthropists and corporate boards. But respect, Cameron had learned, did not translate seamlessly across contexts. It did not always follow you into country clubs or luxury hotels or high-end retail stores, especially when your skin was dark and your presence was unexpected. Cameron's phone rang 20 minutes later, his father's name on the screen. He answered. "Well, that was enlightening," David said, and there was an edge in his voice that Cameron recognized. The controlled anger of a man who had spent decades learning not to show when he was furious. "What happened?" "I called and spoke to Patricia Henley. I told her I wanted to book the ballroom for my birthday, and she was perfectly pleasant until I mentioned that you'd be handling the logistics. Then she got very formal, very by the book. She said that I'd need to add you to my membership account as an authorized user before you could make arrangements, and that there's a process for that which takes a few weeks." "A few weeks?" Cameron repeated. "Dad, you've been a member there for almost 20 years. "I know," David said, "and I've never had to deal with this before. I asked her why this was suddenly an issue, and she said it's always been club policy, that they've just been enforcing it more strictly recently. But Cam, I've watched other members send their kids or their assistants to book events, and I've never seen anyone get this kind of runaround." Cameron felt the anger solidify into something colder, sharper. "So, what do we do?" David was quiet for a moment, and Cameron could picture him in his office at Ashford Capital, the corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Atlanta, his expression thoughtful and calculating. "I'm going to go down there in person," David said finally, "tomorrow morning. I want to talk to the club manager, not just the events coordinator. I want to understand what's happening and why." "Do you want me to come with you?" Cameron asked. "No," David said. "Not yet. Let me handle this first. If it's a legitimate policy issue, we'll sort it out. If it's something else, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." They hung up, and Cameron sat with the phone in his hand, staring out the window of his apartment at the trees beyond, the leaves just beginning to turn. He felt the familiar frustration, the sense of being caught in a system that operated on rules that shifted depending on who you were, that claimed to be fair and meritocratic, but that in practice served to keep certain people in and others out. He thought about his father, who had earned his place at Oaksridge through wealth and success and years of membership dues paid without complaint, and who was now being told that his son, his own son, needed special authorization to help plan a birthday party. Cameron knew that the next few days would reveal whether this was an isolated incident, a bureaucratic hiccup, or something more insidious. He hoped for the former but suspected the latter, and he began to prepare himself for the possibility that his father's birthday celebration, the event that was supposed to be a joyful milestone, was about to become a flashpoint in a fight he had not chosen, but that had chosen him. David Ashford arrived at Oaksridge Country Club at 9:30 on Wednesday morning, driving through the gates with their wrought iron flourishes and the discreet plaque that read, "Members and guests only." The club sat on 200 acres of manicured grounds in the northern suburbs of Atlanta, a sprawl of golf courses and tennis courts, and a clubhouse built in the style of a Georgian manor, all red brick and white columns and windows that reflected the morning sun. David had driven this route hundreds of times, had played golf here with business partners and celebrated anniversaries and milestones, had felt until recently that this was a place where he belonged, where his membership was not just a financial transaction, but a marker of status and acceptance. But as he parked his car in the lot near the clubhouse and walked toward the entrance, he felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the knowledge that something had shifted, that the welcome he had taken for granted was now contingent provisional, subject to rules that appeared and disappeared depending on who was asking. He entered through the main doors, into the lobby, with its marble floors and chandelier, and the faint smell of furniture polish and expensive cologne. The lobby was quiet at this hour, a few members in golf attire heading toward the locker rooms, a woman seated in one of the leather armchairs reading a newspaper. David approached the front desk, where a young man in a navy blazer and club tie stood behind a polished wood counter. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," the young man said, his smile automatic, his name tag reading Ethan Caldwell. "How can I help you today?" "I'd like to speak with the club manager," David said. "Is Mr. Harrington available?" Ethan's smile faltered slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," David said, "but it's regarding a matter with the events department, and I'd like to address it directly." Ethan hesitated, then picked up a phone and dialed an extension. He spoke in a low voice, glancing at David once or twice, and then hung up. "Mr. Harrington can see you briefly. His office is down the hall, second door on the left." David thanked him and walked down the corridor, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, past framed photographs of past club presidents and championship golf tournaments. He knocked on the door marked Club Manager, and a voice called out, "Come in." Gregory Harrington was in his mid-50s, white with silver hair and a tan that suggested many hours on the golf course. He stood as David entered, extending a hand. "David, good to see you. What brings you in today?" David shook his hand, sat in one of the chairs facing the desk. "I need to talk to you about a situation with the events department. My son called yesterday to book the ballroom for my birthday party, and he was told he couldn't make the reservation because he's not listed as an authorized user on my membership account. I called to authorize him, and your events coordinator said there's a weeks-long process to add him. I've been a member here for 18 years, and I've never encountered this policy before." Gregory nodded slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "I see. Well, the authorized user policy is something we implemented about a year ago, as part of an effort to tighten security and ensure that only members and their designated representatives are making arrangements on behalf of the membership." "Security," David repeated, the word heavy with skepticism. "Greg, I'm trying to book a birthday party. My son is my biological son. He's 32 years old, and he's helping me plan the event because I'm busy running a company. Why does he need to go through a formal authorization process to do something that family members, have been doing here for decades? Gregory shifted in his chair, his hands folded on the desk. I understand your frustration, David, but the policy applies to everyone. It's not personal, isn't it? David said quietly. Because I've seen other members' children and assistants book events here without any issue. I've watched it happen. So either the policy isn't being enforced consistently, or it's being enforced selectively, and I'd like to know which it is. There was a pause, and David watched Gregory's face, looking for the flicker of discomfort or evasion that would confirm what he already suspected. Gregory met his gaze, but there was something in his eyes, a wariness, a calculation. David, Gregory said finally, I can assure you that we apply our policies consistently. If there have been instances where the policy wasn't followed, that's an oversight, not an indication of bias. But I can't make exceptions, even for long-standing members like yourself. If you want your son to be able to book events on your behalf, you'll need to add him as an authorized user. I can expedite the process, have it done within a week instead of the usual timeline. David studied him. This man who had greeted him warmly at club functions, who had played golf with him and shared drinks in the bar, who had never once questioned his membership or his right to be here. And now, when David's son, his black son, wanted to help plan a party, suddenly there were policies and processes and timelines that could be expedited but not waived. Let me ask you something, David said, his voice calm but edged with steel. If I were white and my son called to book this event, would Patricia Henley have invoked this policy? Gregory's face flushed. David, I don't appreciate the insinuation. This has nothing to do with race. It's about following the rules. The rules that weren't enforced until my black son tried to book an event, David said. The rules that suddenly matter now, after 18 years of membership. Greg, I'm not stupid. And I'm not going to pretend that I don't see what's happening here. My son was profiled. Your events coordinator heard his name, made assumptions, and decided he needed extra scrutiny. And now you're telling me it's policy, as though invoking policy makes discrimination acceptable. Gregory stood, his expression hardening. I'm sorry you feel that way, David, but I've explained the policy and I've offered to expedite the process. If that's not satisfactory, you're welcome to take your concerns to the membership committee. David stood as well, his hands clenched at his sides. I will, he said. And Greg, I'm going to make sure every member of this club knows what happened here. I'm going to make sure they understand that Oaks Ridge Country Club treats its black members and their families as second class, as requiring extra verification, as not quite trustworthy. Because that's what this is, no matter how you dress it up in policy language. He turned and walked out of the office, his heart pounding, his mind already racing through the implications and the options. He could comply, fill out the paperwork, add Cameron to his membership account, and move forward with the party. Or he could push back, make noise, force the club to confront what had happened and why. The first option was easier, quieter, the path of least resistance. The second was harder, messier, and came with risks. Social ostracism, reputational blowback, the possibility that other members would close ranks and defend the club rather than acknowledge the bias. But as David walked back through the lobby and out to his car, he knew which option he was going to choose. He had not built a $12 billion company by avoiding conflict or accepting conditions he found unacceptable. And he was not going to let his son be treated as suspect, as requiring special authorization to do what other members' children did, without question. He sat in his car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, and then pulled out his phone and called Cameron. Dad? Cameron answered, his voice tight with anticipation. How did it go? Not well, David said. The club manager confirmed the policy, offered to expedite the authorization process, but wouldn't back down. And Cam, I'm convinced this is about race. The way he reacted when I asked directly, the defensiveness, the refusal to acknowledge that the policy might be applied unevenly. This isn't just bureaucracy. This is discrimination. Cameron was silent for a moment, and David could hear the weight of that silence, the years of similar moments accumulating into a pattern. "So what do we do?" Cameron asked finally. "We fight," David said. "We document everything. We file a complaint with the membership committee, and we make sure people know what's happening here. And Cam, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you had to deal with this, and I'm sorry that even after everything I've built, even after all the money and the success and the years of membership, it still isn't enough to protect you from this kind of treatment." "It's not your fault, Dad," Cameron said quietly. "This is on them, not you." "I know," David said, "but I'm still going to fix it." Over the next several days, David Ashford did exactly what he had promised. He wrote a detailed letter to the Oaks Ridge Country Club Membership Committee, outlining what had happened, providing a timeline, and requesting a formal review of the club's policies and their application. He made copies of his correspondence with the events coordinator, documented the phone calls and the meeting with Gregory Harrington, and assembled a file that was thorough, factual, and impossible to dismiss as mere misunderstanding. He also reached out to other black members of the club, a small group that numbered fewer than a dozen families out of a total membership of over 500. David had always been cordial with these families, had played golf with some of them, but they had never formed a tight-knit group, had never banded together in any formal way. Now, though, David felt it was time to connect, to compare experiences, to understand whether what had happened to Cameron was isolated or part of a pattern. He started with Marcus Reed, a cardiologist in his early 50s who had been a member for about a decade. They met for coffee at a neutral location, a cafe in Buckhead, and David laid out what had happened. Marcus listened, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded, and when David finished, Marcus said, "That doesn't surprise me. I've had my own issues with the club. Nothing as overt as what you're describing, but small things. Being asked for my membership card more often than I see white members asked. Having the valet take longer to bring my car. Comments from other members that feel like they're probing whether I really belong there." "Have you ever filed a complaint?" David asked. Marcus shook his head. "No. I figured it wasn't worth the hassle, that it would just make me a target. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe if we'd been more vocal earlier, this wouldn't be happening now." They talked for another hour, strategizing, discussing who else to reach out to, how to build a coalition without alienating potential allies among the white membership. By the time they parted, David had commitments from Marcus and 2 other black members to sign onto a joint letter to the membership committee, and plans to meet again the following week. Meanwhile, Cameron was conducting his own research. He had started digging into Oaks Ridge's history, looking for patterns, for complaints, for any indication that the club had a track record of discrimination. What he found was illuminating and disturbing in equal measure. Oaks Ridge had been founded in 1952, and for the first 4 decades of its existence, it had been whites only, explicitly excluding black people and Jews from membership. The club had integrated in the early 1990s, under pressure from legal challenges and shifting social norms, but integration had been grudging, minimal. Even now, in 2025, the membership was overwhelmingly white, and the few black families who belonged were often wealthy professionals who had fought hard for acceptance. Cameron also found records of complaints filed over the years by black members, archived in local news articles and civil rights organization databases. The complaints were similar, being followed by staff, having their guest privileges questioned, being asked to show ID more frequently than white members, facing longer wait times for tea times and court reservations. Most of the complaints had been dismissed or settled quietly, with the club issuing generic statements about commitment to diversity and inclusion without making meaningful changes. He compiled all of this into a document, shared it with his father, and together they began to see the outline of a strategy. This was not just about a birthday party or a booking policy. It was about a club that had never fully reckoned with its history of exclusion, that had allowed the culture of that history to persist even as the formal barriers came down, and that was now using facially neutral policies to continue the work of gatekeeping and exclusion. If you are still with this story, still following Cameron and David as they navigate a system that was designed to keep people like them out, then you understand that this fight is about more than country club access. It is about the ways that institutions protect their own, about the ways that power operates through politeness and procedure, and about the courage it takes to name bias when everyone around you insists it does not exist. And if this resonates with you, if you see echoes of your own struggles or the struggles of people you care about, then consider sharing this story, talking about it, letting it be part of the larger conversation about who belongs and who decides. The membership committee met on the second Tuesday of October, and David was invited to present his concerns in person. The committee consisted of 7 members, all white, all long-time club fixtures, and they sat around a polished mahogany table in a conference room adjacent to the club's administrative offices. David entered with a folder of documents, dressed in a suit, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. The committee chair, a man named Reginald Patterson, who had made his fortune in real estate, opened the meeting with a statement acknowledging David's concerns and thanking him for bringing them to the committee's attention. Then he invited David to speak. David stood, distributed copies of his documentation, and walked the committee through what had happened. He was precise, factual, letting the timeline and the correspondence speak for themselves. He pointed out the inconsistencies in how the authorized user policy had been applied, the lack of prior notice that such a policy existed, and the defensive response from club management when the issue was raised. And then he said, voice steady and firm, "Gentlemen, I want to be very clear about what I believe happened here. My son was profiled. When he called to book an event on my behalf, he was treated differently than other members' family members would have been treated, and that differential treatment was based on race. The policy that was invoked to justify denying him access is a policy that, as far as I can tell, has not been consistently enforced, and certainly was not enforced in the past when I or other white members made similar arrangements. I am not asking for special treatment. I am asking for equal treatment, and I am asking this committee to investigate whether the club's policies are being applied in a discriminatory manner." There was silence when he finished, the kind of silence that feels heavy, charged. Reginald cleared his throat and said, "Thank you, David. We take your concerns seriously, and we will review the matter thoroughly. Is there anything else you'd like to add?" David glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of each committee member. "Yes," he said. "I want to know whether this club is committed to true inclusion or whether integration here is just performative, a box to check so that you can say you're not discriminatory while maintaining the same culture of exclusion that has existed since the club was founded. Because if it's the latter, then I don't want to be a member here, and I don't think any self-respecting black person should be." The words landed like a stone in still water, and David could see the ripples of discomfort spread across the faces of the men seated around the table. Reginald's expression tightened, and he said, "David, no one here wants you to feel that way. We value your membership, and we want to resolve this issue." "Then resolve it," David said. "Investigate the policy, review how it's been applied, and if you find evidence of discriminatory enforcement, take action. Real action, not just a statement and a promise to do better." He left the meeting without waiting for a response, walking out into the October sunshine with the sense that he had done what he could, had said what needed to be said, and now the outcome was out of his hands. He knew that the committee might choose to circle the wagons, to protect the club's reputation and the staff's actions, to frame his complaint as the grievance of an oversensitive member rather than a legitimate claim of discrimination. Or they might surprise him, might actually investigate, might find what he suspected they would find if they looked honestly at the pattern of behavior. 2 weeks passed with no word from the committee. David continued to research, to talk to other black members, to document every interaction he had with the club. Cameron, meanwhile, had made a decision of his own. He was not going to wait for the committee to act. He was going to take the story public. Cameron had a friend from college, a journalist named Alicia Grant, who now worked for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, covering social issues and civil rights. He reached out to her, explained what had happened, and offered to go on record. Alicia was interested, but she wanted more than just Cameron's story. She wanted corroboration, context, a sense of whether this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. Cameron connected her with his father, with Marcus Reed and the other black members who had signed onto the joint letter, and with a civil rights attorney named Brenda Wallace, who had worked on discrimination cases involving private clubs in the past. Alicia spent several days conducting interviews, reviewing documents, and researching Oaks Ridge's history, and then, in late October, she published a story under the headline, "Exclusive Atlanta Country Club Faces Allegations of Discrimination Against Black Members." The article was thorough, detailed, and damning. It included Cameron's account of being denied the ability to book his father's birthday party, David's meeting with the club manager and the membership committee, and testimony from other black members who described a pattern of differential treatment. It included historical context about the club's whites-only origins and its reluctant integration. And it included a response from Oaks Ridge's management, a statement that reiterated the club's commitment to diversity and inclusion while denying that any discrimination had occurred. The story was published online on a Thursday morning, and by noon it was trending on social media. People shared it, commented on it, used it as an example of how racism persisted in institutions that claimed to have moved beyond it. Several high-profile black professionals in Atlanta who were not members of Oaks Ridge weighed in, expressing solidarity with the Ashfords and calling for accountability. A few white members of the club also spoke out, some defending the club, others admitting that they had witnessed or been uncomfortable with the treatment of black members. The backlash was swift and divided. Some people applauded Cameron and David for speaking out, for refusing to let the incident be swept under the rug. Others accused them of overreacting, of playing the race card, of trying to destroy the club's reputation over a simple misunderstanding. The debate played out on Twitter, on Facebook, in the comment sections of news articles, and in private conversations at dinner tables and office water coolers across Atlanta. Oaks Ridge Country Club, caught off guard by the publicity, scrambled to respond. The club's board of directors issued a statement announcing that they would be conducting an independent review of their policies and practices, and that they were committed to ensuring that all members were treated with respect and dignity. Gregory Harrington, the club manager, was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review, and Patricia Henley, the events coordinator, was quietly reassigned to a different role. But for Cameron and David, the real measure of success was not in the club's response, but in the conversations that the story had sparked. People were talking about the ways that exclusion persisted in supposedly integrated spaces, about the difference between formal equality and substantive inclusion, about the responsibility of institutions to confront their histories and change their cultures. And while some of those conversations were difficult and uncomfortable, they were also necessary, a reckoning that had been delayed for too long. Cameron's phone rang constantly in the days after the article was published. Friends and former colleagues reached out to offer support, to share their own stories of being excluded or profiled, to thank him for speaking out. But he also received hate mail, messages from anonymous accounts accusing him of being ungrateful, of not appreciating the privilege his father's wealth afforded him, of making everything about race. He read some of the messages, deleted others, and tried to remind himself that the discomfort he was feeling was a sign that the story was having an impact, that it was forcing people to confront truths they would rather ignore. David, for his part, braced for the fallout. He knew that taking the story public would have consequences, that some of his business relationships might suffer, that he might be ostracized by parts of Atlanta's elite social scene. And indeed, within days of the article's publication, he received calls from acquaintances at the club, some expressing support, others urging him to back down, to let the issue be resolved quietly, to consider the damage he was doing to the club's reputation. One call in particular stood out. It was from a man named Charles Whitman, a fellow private equity investor and longtime Oaksridge member, someone David had considered a friend. Charles's voice on the phone was strained, careful. "David, I just wanted to reach out, see how you're doing. I know this whole thing with the club has been difficult." "Thanks, Charles," David said, waiting for the real purpose of the call. "Look, I understand you're upset," Charles continued, "and I'm not saying the club handled this perfectly. But I worry that going public, getting the media involved, it's only going to make things worse. It makes the club look bad, sure, but it also makes you look like you're trying to score points, like you're playing politics instead of working through the proper channels." David felt his jaw tighten. "Charles, I did work through the proper channels. I filed a complaint with the membership committee. I met with the club manager. I documented everything, and nothing changed. Going public wasn't my first choice, but it was the only way to get anyone to take this seriously." "I hear you," Charles said. "But David, you have to understand, this is a club. It's a private organization, and members value discretion. When you air grievances in the press, you're violating that social contract. You're making other members uncomfortable, putting the club's reputation at risk. Is it really worth it?" David felt the anger rise, hot and sharp. "Is it worth it?" he repeated. "Charles, my son was treated like a potential thief because he tried to help plan my birthday party. He was profiled, subjected to policies that weren't applied to other members' families. And when I raised concerns, I was stonewalled. So yes, it's worth it. Because the alternative is to stay silent, to accept that this is just how things are, and I'm not willing to do that." There was a pause on the line, and then Charles said, voice cooler now, "I'm sorry you feel that way, David. I hope you understand that there may be consequences." "I do," David said, "and I'm prepared for them." They hung up, and David sat with the phone in his hand, feeling the weight of that conversation, the implicit threat, the message that speaking out came with a price. But he also felt a clarity, a certainty that he had made the right choice, that the discomfort and the pushback were signs that the story was disrupting something, that it was challenging a status quo that had existed for too long. The independent review commissioned by Oaksridge's board of directors took 6 weeks. The board hired an outside consulting firm that specialized in diversity and inclusion audits, and the firm spent those weeks interviewing staff, reviewing policies and procedures, analyzing complaint records, and surveying members. The process was thorough, invasive, and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved, and by the time the results were released in early December, the club was already a different place, changed by the scrutiny and the conversations it had been forced to have. The report, which was made public at David's insistence, found that Oaksridge Country Club had systemic issues with the equitable treatment of black members and their families. It documented inconsistencies in how policies were applied, noted that black members were more likely to be asked for ID and to have their guest privileges questioned, and found that staff had received inadequate training on bias and discrimination. The report stopped short of calling the treatment of Cameron Ashford overtly discriminatory, noting that the authorized user policy was technically legitimate, but it acknowledged that the policy had been invoked selectively and that the events coordinator's handling of the situation had been problematic and suggestive of bias. The report made a series of recommendations: mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, revised policies that were clearer and more consistently enforced, the creation of a diversity and inclusion committee, and the appointment of an ombudsman to handle complaints. It also recommended that the club conduct an audit of its membership practices to understand why black membership remained so low and what barriers might exist to greater inclusion. Oaksridge's board of directors accepted the report and committed to implementing its recommendations. Gregory Harrington, the club manager, resigned, citing personal reasons but widely understood to have been pushed out. Patricia Henley, the events coordinator, left the club as well, taking a position elsewhere, and the board issued a public apology to David and Cameron Ashford, acknowledging that they had been treated unfairly and committing to doing better. It was, by most measures, a victory. The club had been forced to confront its practices, to make changes, to acknowledge that discrimination had occurred. But for David and Cameron, the victory felt incomplete, unsatisfying, because while policies could be changed and staff could be trained, culture was harder to shift. The question was whether Oaksridge would truly transform, or whether the changes would be superficial, a veneer of inclusion over the same underlying assumptions and behaviors. David decided not to hold his birthday party at Oaksridge. He could have, now that the issue had been resolved and the club had made its apologies. But the place no longer felt like home, no longer felt like somewhere he wanted to celebrate a milestone. Instead, he and Cameron found a different venue, a historic mansion in downtown Atlanta that was owned by a black entrepreneur and frequently hosted events for the city's black elite. The party was beautiful, joyful, attended by family and friends and business associates who filled the space with laughter and music and the warmth of genuine community. At one point during the evening, Cameron found his father standing alone on a balcony, looking out at the Atlanta skyline, and he joined him, the two of them silent for a moment in the cool November air. "You okay, Dad?" Cameron asked. David nodded. "Yeah, I'm good. Better than good, actually. This feels right, being here instead of at Oaksridge. I think we made the right call." Cameron smiled. "I think so too. And Dad, thank you, for fighting for me, for not letting them get away with it." David turned to look at his son, saw the young man he had raised, the one who had inherited not just his wealth, but his stubbornness, his refusal to accept less than he deserved. "You don't have to thank me, Cam. This is what family does. We stand up for each other. Always." They stood together in the cool air, the sounds of the party drifting out from inside, and Cameron thought about the journey they had been on, the phone call that had started it all, the fight that had followed, the victory that was imperfect but real. He thought about the other black families at Oaksridge, the ones who were still navigating that space, who would benefit from the changes that had been forced through, and he felt a sense of purpose, of having contributed to something larger than himself. And if you have followed this story to this point, if you have walked with Cameron and David through the frustration and the fight and the slow, uneven progress toward accountability, then you know that this is not just about a country club or a birthday party. It is about the ways that institutions resist change, about the courage it takes to challenge them, and about the solidarity that makes that challenge possible. If this story has resonated with you, if it has reminded you of your own experiences or inspired you to think differently about the systems around you, then share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who is fighting their own battles, someone who could use the reminder that speaking out matters, that change is possible, and that none of us has to face these fights alone. The months that followed brought continued evolution, both for Oaksridge and for the Ashford family. The club, true to its commitments, implemented the training and policy changes recommended in the report. The new club manager, a woman named Stephanie Rodriguez, who had a background in hospitality and a reputation for progressive leadership, made it a priority to engage with black members, to understand their experiences, and to create a culture where they felt genuinely welcome. She held town halls, created feedback mechanisms, and made herself available in ways that Gregory Harrington never had. The changes were noticeable, incremental. Black members reported feeling less scrutinized, less othered. The staff became more conscious of their language and their assumptions. New members were recruited with an eye toward diversity, and over the course of a year, the percentage of black families in the club's membership grew from less than 2% to just over 5%. It was still far from representative, but it was progress, and it signaled that the club was making a genuine effort to change, but not everyone was happy. Some long-time members, particularly those who had been at the club since before integration, grumbled about the changes, about the focus on diversity, about what they saw as political correctness run amok. A few resigned their memberships in protest, issuing statements about how the club had lost its way, had become too focused on appeasing critics rather than serving its members. Their departures were noted, mourned by some, celebrated by others, as a sign that the club was finally shedding the last vestiges of its exclusionary past. David Ashford remained a member, but his relationship with the club was different now. He no longer felt the same sense of belonging, the same ease. He still played golf there occasionally, still attended events, but he was always aware, in a way he had not been before, of the dynamics at play, of who was welcomed and who was tolerated, of the invisible lines that still existed, even as the formal barriers came down. It was exhausting, this hyper-awareness, and there were times when he considered resigning, walking away, finding community elsewhere. But he stayed, in part because he believed his presence mattered, that having black members who were visible and vocal was important for holding the club accountable, and in part because he had invested so much into the fight that leaving felt like conceding defeat. It was a complicated decision, and one he revisited often, weighing the costs and benefits, the emotional toll against the symbolic significance. Cameron, meanwhile, had become something of an advocate. The publicity around the Oaks Ridge incident had raised his profile, and he found himself invited to speak at panels and conferences about discrimination in elite spaces, about the ways that wealth did not insulate black people from bias, about the importance of institutional accountability. He was ambivalent about this role, uncomfortable with the spotlight, but he also recognized that his story had resonated, that it had given language and visibility to experiences that were often dismissed or minimized. He spoke at a conference for black professionals in Atlanta, sharing the stage with activists and entrepreneurs and artists, and he told the story of the phone call, the runaround, the fight. He talked about the exhaustion of having to prove yourself over and over, of being treated as suspect in spaces where you had every right to be, of the decision to speak out rather than stay silent. And at the end of his talk, a young woman approached him, her eyes bright with emotion, and said, "Thank you. That happened to me at my gym. I thought I was imagining it, thought maybe I was being too sensitive. But hearing your story, knowing I'm not alone, it helps." Cameron felt the weight of that, the responsibility of having his story be part of something larger, and he told her, "You're not imagining it, and you're not too sensitive. Trust your instincts, and if you feel safe doing so, speak up. Because the more of us who do, the harder it becomes for them to dismiss us." The conversation stayed with him, became part of the reason he continued to speak out, to share his story, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it invited scrutiny and criticism. Because he understood now that individual stories, when told clearly and honestly, could shift the way people thought about systems, could make the invisible visible, could create the conditions for change. By the summer of 2026, Nearly a year after the initial incident, Cameron and his father sat down for dinner at a restaurant in Buckhead, just the two of them, to reflect on what had happened and what it meant. They ordered wine, talked about work and family and the upcoming election, and then David said, "Cam, I've been thinking a lot about the club, about whether I should stay a member or just walk away." Cameron looked at his father, saw the weariness in his eyes, the toll that the fight had taken. "What's your gut telling you?" David sighed. "My gut says I'm tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of being the representative black member. Tired of navigating a space that still doesn't fully want me there. But my head says that leaving sends the wrong message, that it lets them off the hook, that it abandons the other black members who are still there and who need allies." Cameron nodded. "I get that. But Dad, you don't owe them anything. You've already done more than most people would have. If staying is making you miserable, if it's costing you your peace, then you have permission to walk away." David met his son's gaze, saw the compassion there, the understanding. "What about you? How are you doing with all of this?" Cameron considered the question, thought about the speaking engagements and the interviews and the conversations with strangers who treated him like a symbol rather than a person. "I'm okay," he said. "It's been a lot, and there are days when I wish I'd just let it go, when I wonder if it was worth the stress and the scrutiny. But then I think about that woman at the conference and the messages I get from people saying my story helped them understand their own experiences, and I feel like it mattered, like we made a difference, even if it's smaller than we'd hoped." David reached across the table, squeezed his son's hand. "I'm proud of you, Cam, for speaking out, for not backing down, for handling all of this with grace and integrity. You're a better man than I was at your age." Cameron smiled, felt the warmth of his father's approval, the bond that had been strengthened through the fight. "I learned from the best." They finished their dinner, paid the check, and walked out into the Atlanta evening, the city alive with lights and sounds and the hum of people going about their lives. And as they stood on the sidewalk, saying goodbye before heading to their respective cars, David said, "You know, I think I'm going to resign from Oaks Ridge. I've thought about it, and I don't want to spend the next decade of my life fighting the same fights. I'd rather put my energy into spaces where I'm genuinely wanted, where I don't have to prove my worth." Cameron nodded. "I think that's the right call, Dad. You've earned the right to choose peace over principle, at least in this one area." David smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thanks, Cam. And hey, we should start looking for a new place to play golf. Maybe somewhere that doesn't come with all the baggage." "Sounds like a plan," Cameron said, and they parted ways, each heading into the night with a sense of closure, of having fought the fight and come out the other side, battered but intact, wiser and more aware of the work that remained. David Ashford submitted his resignation from Oaks Ridge Country Club in August of 2026, 18 months after the incident that had started it all. His letter was brief, professional, thanking the club for the years of membership, but stating that he had decided to pursue other recreational opportunities. He did not elaborate on his reasons, did not cite the discrimination or the fight, because he did not owe them an explanation. The resignation was noted by the club's board, acknowledged with a polite letter thanking him for his membership, and that was the end of it. Or almost the end. Because 2 weeks after David's resignation became known, 3 other black families at Oaks Ridge also resigned, citing similar concerns about the club's culture and their experiences as members. Their departures were covered by the local media, framed as a continued fallout from the discrimination scandal, and it put renewed pressure on the club to examine why it was losing the very members it had committed to better serving. Stephanie Rodriguez, the club manager, was reportedly frustrated by the resignations, by the sense that the club was still failing despite the efforts to change. She held another round of town halls, this time specifically for black members and prospective members, to understand what more could be done. The conversations were difficult, honest, revealing that while policies had changed, the culture had not shifted as much as the leadership had hoped. Black members still felt like guests in a space that was fundamentally not theirs, still felt the weight of being watched, judged, required to represent their entire race. The challenge, as one member articulated, was that diversity and inclusion were not the same as belonging, that you could have a diverse membership on paper while still maintaining a culture that privileged whiteness, that centered white comfort, that treated black presence as conditional. And changing that culture required more than training and policies. It required a fundamental reimagining of what the club was, who it served, and what values it wanted to embody. It was work that would take years, maybe decades, and it was work that Oaks Ridge Country Club was only beginning to undertake. Whether the club would succeed, whether it would become a genuinely inclusive space, or would remain a site of contested belonging, was an open question, one that would be answered not by statements or reports, but by the lived experiences of its members, by whether black families felt welcome and valued, by whether their children could call the club without being subjected to extra scrutiny, by whether the assumptions and biases that had shaped the club for decades could finally be dismantled. Meanwhile, David and Cameron Ashford moved forward with their lives, finding new places to spend their time, new communities to invest in. David joined a golf club in downtown Atlanta that was majority black, a newer club that had been founded explicitly as an alternative to the old guard institutions like Oaks Ridge. The culture was different, warmer, less formal, and David found himself relaxing in ways he had not realized he needed. He played golf without thinking about how he was being perceived, attended events without the low-level anxiety of wondering whether he was welcome, and reconnected with the joy of recreation without the burden of representation. Cameron, too, found his footing in the aftermath of the incident. He continued his work as a software engineer, was promoted to a senior role at his company, and became more involved in mentorship programs for young black professionals in tech. He used his story when it was relevant as a teaching tool, a way to illustrate the challenges of navigating predominantly white spaces. But he also worked to build his identity beyond that story, to be known for his skills and his contributions, rather than just the discrimination he had faced. And in December of 2026, Cameron met someone. Her name was Jasmine Clark, and she was an attorney specializing in employment law, someone who understood the complexities of bias and discrimination in professional settings. They met at a mutual friend's holiday party, started talking, and discovered a connection that was easy, natural, grounded in shared experiences and values. Cameron told her about Oaks Ridge early in their relationship, wanting her to know what she was getting into, and Jasmine listened with empathy and understanding, then said, "I'm glad you spoke out. I'm glad you didn't let them get away with it. That takes courage." They dated through the winter and into the spring, and by the time summer arrived, Cameron was certain that he wanted to build a life with her. He proposed in June on the rooftop of his apartment building, with the Atlanta skyline glowing in the distance, and Jasmine said yes, tears in her eyes, her hand trembling as he slid the ring onto her finger. They planned a wedding for the following spring, and as they worked through the logistics, the venues, and the guest lists, and all the details that go into such an event, Cameron thought about the call he had made to Oaks Ridge, the one that had started everything. He thought about how different his life might have been if he had simply accepted the runaround, if he had filled out the paperwork and added himself as an authorized user and moved on. He would have avoided the fight, the publicity, the stress, but he also would have missed the clarity that came from standing up, the sense of purpose that came from refusing to accept unequal treatment, the connections he had made with other people who had faced similar challenges. And standing at the altar on his wedding day, in a venue that was owned by a black family and decorated by black vendors and filled with people who loved him and Jasmine, Cameron felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for what had happened at Oaks Ridge, but for what he had learned from it, for the strength he had discovered in himself, for the solidarity he had found in his father and in the broader community of people who refused to stay silent. David Ashford gave a toast at the reception, his voice warm and proud, and he said, "Cam, I've watched you grow from a boy into a man, and I've been honored to be your father through all of it. The last few years haven't been easy, but you've handled every challenge with grace and courage. You've taught me that fighting for what's right isn't about winning every battle. It's about refusing to accept injustice, about standing up even when it's hard, about using your voice and your platform to make the world a little bit better. I'm so proud of you, and I'm so grateful that Jasmine is joining our family. Here's to you both, to a life filled with love and joy and the courage to keep fighting the good fight." The room erupted in applause, and Cameron felt the tears prick at his eyes, felt the weight of his father's words, the acknowledgement of the journey they had been on together. And as he looked around the room, at the faces of family and friends, at Jasmine beside him radiant and beautiful, he felt a deep sense of peace, of having come through something difficult and emerged on the other side stronger, more certain of who he was and what he stood for. If you have stayed with this story through all its turns, through the anger and the fight and the moments of doubt and the eventual resolution, then you understand that this is not just about Cameron Ashford or Oaks Ridge Country Club. It is about the everyday work of resistance, about the choice to speak out rather than stay silent, about the ways that individual stories can become part of a larger movement toward justice. And if this story has touched you, if it has made you think or feel or see something new, then carry it with you. Share it with others. Let it be part of the conversations you have about belonging and exclusion, about who gets to occupy spaces of privilege and who has to fight for access. Because stories like this matter, and they grow stronger when more people hear them and decide to add their voices to the chorus demanding change. The years continued to unfold, bringing new challenges and new victories. Oaks Ridge Country Club, under Stephanie Rodriguez's leadership, made incremental progress, though it remained a work in progress, a site of contested belonging where some members felt fully at home and others still felt like they were being tolerated rather than embraced. The club's black membership grew slowly, reaching 8% by 2028, and while that was an improvement, it was still far from representative, still a sign that much work remained. Other private clubs in Atlanta and across the country took note of what had happened at Oaks Ridge, and some used it as a cautionary tale, implementing their own diversity initiatives and training programs to avoid similar controversies. Others circled the wagons, doubling down on exclusivity, framing the push for inclusion as an attack on tradition and private association. The landscape was shifting but unevenly, and the battle for access and belonging in elite spaces continued, fought in courtrooms and boardrooms, and in the daily interactions between members and staff. Cameron and Jasmine built a life together, buying a house in a diverse neighborhood in Atlanta, starting a family. Their daughter, born in 2029, was named Maya, and she was raised with stories of her grandfather's success, her father's courage, and the importance of standing up for what was right. Cameron and Jasmine were intentional about the values they instilled in her, about teaching her to recognize bias, to question systems, to use her voice and her privilege to advocate for others. And when Maya was 5 years old, sitting at the dinner table one evening, she asked her father, "Daddy, what's a country club?" Cameron glanced at Jasmine, then smiled at his daughter and said, "It's a place where people go to play golf and swim and have parties. Some of them are nice, and some of them have a history of not being nice to everyone." "Did you go to one?" Maya asked. "I tried too," Cameron said, "and I had some trouble there because of the color of my skin. But I spoke up about it, and some things changed." Maya considered this, her young face serious. "That was brave." "Thank you, sweetheart," Cameron said. "Sometimes being brave means saying something even when it's hard. And I hope you'll remember that as you grow up, that you'll use your voice to stand up for yourself and for others." Maya nodded, and the conversation moved on to other things, but Cameron felt the weight of that moment, the passing of values from one generation to the next, the hope that his daughter would inherit not just his wealth, but his commitment to justice, his refusal to accept unequal treatment. David Ashford, now in his 70s, remained active in business and philanthropy, using his wealth and influence to support causes he cared about: education, economic development, criminal justice reform. He thought often about the incident at Oaksridge, about the fight and the cost and the outcome, and he remained convinced that he had made the right choice, that speaking out had been necessary even if it had been difficult. And when he looked back on his life, on the company he had built and the family he had raised and the battles he had fought, he felt a sense of satisfaction, not because everything had gone the way he wanted, not because the world was fair or just, but because he had lived according to his values, had refused to compromise his dignity, and had taught his son to do the same. One afternoon in the fall of 2030, David and Cameron sat together on the porch of David's house, watching Maya play in the yard, and David said, "You know, Cam, I've been thinking about that whole Oaksridge situation. It's been 5 years now, and I still don't regret it, do you?" Cameron shook his head. "No, it was hard, and there were moments when I wished we'd just let it go. But I think it mattered. I think we made a difference." David nodded. "We did. Maybe not as big a difference as we'd hoped, but a difference nonetheless. And that's all we can do, really. Fight the fights that are in front of us, speak the truth as we see it, and trust that it adds up to something." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Maya chase a butterfly across the grass, her laughter bright and clear in the autumn air, and Cameron felt a deep sense of gratitude for his father, for the example he had set, for the courage he had shown. And he thought about the future, about the world Maya would inherit, and he allowed himself to hope that it would be a little bit better, a little bit more just, because of the fights that had been fought, the voices that had been raised, the refusal to accept things as they were. And if you have journeyed through this story, if you have walked with Cameron and David through the frustration and the fight and the slow, uneven progress toward something better, then you know that change is possible, that individual actions matter, that speaking out can shift systems, even when those systems resist change. This story is not just about a country club or a booking policy or a birthday party. It is about the larger work of building a world where everyone belongs, where access is not contingent on race or wealth or connections, where the assumptions that shape how we see each other can be challenged and changed. And if this story has resonated with you, if it has reminded you of your own experiences or inspired you to think differently about the systems around you, then share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who is navigating their own battles, someone who could use the reminder that they are not alone, that their voice matters, and that together we can create the change we want to see.